Before we even get on today's topic, I want to make just sort of one opening statement, which is, the whole purpose of doing these workshop groups, I think as we stated before, is so people can be effective leaders in whatever sphere of influence that the Lord has put you in. And in order to do that, I think one of the hopes is that that all of us have these lives that are kind of constantly moving forward. And I've been thinking about this because a friend of mine asked another friend of mine recently to become guardian of their kids in the event that they were to pass. And I was asking friend one why he asked friend two to do so. And he made an interesting comment. He said, because friend two has a very dynamic faith. In other words, their faith is constantly, it's not so much that their faith is not changing in the sense that they have new beliefs, but the manner in which they're following Jesus, they seem to constantly be discovering new ways to explore intimacy with God and actually to live that out. And I was really drawn to that comment because I think sort of the sad truth is that, in my view, like a lot of Christians just feel stuck. They're just sort of stuck in whatever place that they're in, and then a couple of years goes by, 5 years go by, 10 years go by, and they're just sort of wherever they were. And like, again, that's not, that statement can sound a little harsh, and I'm not trying to obviously be harsh with that statement, but just sort of, in so many ways, like if we don't actually take responsibility over how we're changing and how we're growing, if we don't actually make it a priority to have a dynamic faith in some sense, we're going to be caught in the drift. And so that's basically what we're trying to do here. We're trying to be people who are constantly discovering new ways to grow in our intimacy with God, experimenting with new ways in terms of how to try to reach the lost, how to be more fully alive in whatever vocational field we're in. And so ultimately that's the kind of backdrop of why we're doing what we're doing here. All right? Okay, so with that, the topic this week is becoming or being a trustworthy leader. This is meant to be interactive and a discussion as well, so please keep that in mind. Let's start with the question, why does everyone want to live in New York City? Curious. I'm curious what people's thoughts are answering to this.
It's the best.
Everyone want to live in New York?
I do.
Okay, wait, Stella, what was your answer?
It's the best.
Yeah.
Well,
The best. Okay, what do you mean by that, the best?
It has everything.
Good.
It has everything.
What do you mean by everything?
Whatever I want.
Whatever I want.
It's got all the things I want.
Food.
Interesting.
Good food. Diverse.
Good food.
Opportunities.
Opportunities. All these things.
People.
If you want to be anything, the best of the best are here. Like anything is possible in New York. If you like have the drive to make it happen, you can make it happen.
Frank Sinatra, right?
If I can.
Make it there.
That's not karaoke. That too.
What everyone said is sort of where I was trying to go with this. It's because everyone and everything is in New York City. What I mean by that is we don't really have a particularly, if you think about it, like it's not like we have the greatest climate. We don't have particularly beautiful natural scenery. But it's just the fact that there's so many people here. It's not an accident that Hamilton comes from New York City. It's not an accident that all the great restaurants and so many of the great chefs decide to park themselves here. But it's the concentration of so many people that basically makes New York this incredibly interesting and dynamic place. I mean, I remember I was having this conversation the other day, like post 9/11, there was definitely, that was 17 and a half years ago. Can you guys believe that? But there was like a long, drawn out discussion around, well, is anyone even gonna want to live in New York anymore? And then post the financial crisis in 2008, basically, as the financial services sector started to shrink, it was like, will New York still be a preeminent place? And it is because basically tech, like I I think Amazon's still coming in to clean. I don't know. Apparently they're rethinking that. But like Google, Facebook, all these folks, like basically tech has become, and it shows because New York is an incredibly dynamic place because it supports so much life. So many people are able to exist on this tiny little island. The question is, what enables all this? Like, how are there almost 10 million people in an area the quarter the size of the smallest state of Rhode Island? Like on any given day, there's almost like 10 million people in Manhattan when you include, I think there's 8.6 the official population, and then you include all the people that commute in, exactly, from New York, from New Jersey and the outer boroughs. There's like tourists, there's like 10 million people here on this tiny little place. What enables all this? The answer is basically laws. Lots and lots of laws. And so I have a particular sort of experience with this because basically when we purchased this building, we had to basically hire 5 different attorneys because there were so many different laws that we had to abide by. There was like a specific person on land use, another person on nonprofit law, another person on zoning. I mean, there were so many stinking regulations that you have to abide by that I didn't even know existed, much less that there's a specialty in each area. So to support this much activity, it actually requires like a ton of laws. And
Lawyers love it.
true that. Has anyone ever served on a co-op board or a condo board? Probably not, because, oh, actually, Jill has.
But in Los Angeles.
Okay, in New York City. Has anyone, raise your hand if you served on a condo board or co-op board. Good for you if you haven't, because it can be a really miserable experience. I've done it twice.
Yeah.
A lot of times, people who serve on co-op boards are basically really angry and embittered people.
It's a Seinfeld episode, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
But what happens is, part of the reason why they're so embittered is because the topic of how to create the rules for how X hundred people can basically live on top of each other, and the amount of stuff that like just sort of comes up in the context of trying to live together is crazy. But that's basically what enables all this. You have these city laws, and then you have individual building laws. I mean, part of the challenge of this enterprise that I think some of you guys are aware of, that we're trying to do with these 2 other families, is that we needed to come up with actually laws and like rules on how to relate to one another, because you think you know how to relate to one another, but when it actually comes down to trying to live together, it's a whole separate thing. So the bottom line I'm trying to say is that basically laws, lots and lots of laws are necessary for any collective action. Anytime people are going to be around one another, we need lots and lots of laws. Where else do we see lots and lots of laws?
The Bible.
Leviticus.
Very, very good. We are all one.
Yeah,
we are a total board here. Leviticus,
Yeah.
right? It's not like I had 3 different slides depending on the answer. This was the only slide. Leviticus, all these laws exist because God wanted to interact with his people, and he had a specific protocol in mind for what it meant for his people to be set apart. I mean, I listened to a great talk a couple of years ago by this lady about just sort of like an overview of Old Testament law, because especially if you're new to faith, you're just like, God, what is with all these things? Like, you know, a wave offering, like the specific steps that are needed to basically that you need to abide by, you know, laws on sacrifice, laws about the priest, dealing with uncleanliness and holiness. But obviously the point is that, you know, the proper lens, I think, is that God wanted so desperately to be close to us. But if we attempted to be close to God, what would happen? His fire would consume us, right? It was basically impossible. And so God was like, gosh, I want to be so close to my people, but if I just show up, I'll basically incinerate them. And so instead, like, there are all these different rules, essentially laws, that basically adjudicate how we would relate to God. So laws are necessary for any society to function, but there are basically limits to laws, and this is mainly because contracting and enforcement is very, very expensive. This is part of the reason why the blockchain is such a popular concept. You guys know, like, Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Everyone knows what Bitcoin is. Basically, the blockchain is basically part of the reason why a lot of people are so excited about it is because it's reducing the cost of contracting and enforcement. However, there's still always going to be limits to laws. And basically, the alternative to laws is a framework that is based on trust. A framework that is based on trust. And basically, the claim is to be an effective follower of Jesus and a leader in your respective setting, being trustworthy is absolutely essential. That's just a quick example of how, I'll again just like talk about, like when we went to purchase this building, I remember I told the broker, I was like, look, we're gonna need about a month for all these lawyers to figure out if we can do what we want to do here. And so the trouble was, before we go spend X tens of thousands of dollars on these legal fees, I need to know that in the event that we can purchase, you don't sell the building to someone else. You see what I'm saying? Like, so we needed, like, we basically needed trust, right? We couldn't write a contract. We couldn't write a contract where we say, hey, you can't sell this for the next 30 days. Just writing that contract would have been hell. But the broker was actually a very reputable person. And she basically said, I give you my word. And you can ask around anywhere if my word is worth anything. So I did ask around. And there was enough that gave me the confidence to say, hey, look, it's worth it. Let's go and do this. And, presumably, if all things work out on our end, we'll be able to proceed with the transaction, and here we are today. But the trust, without that trust, basically, in principle, this thing would never have happened. And there are countless examples where trust becomes. I mean, there's a whole literature around the way trust basically is like the grease by which society essentially works. Like without it. And like trust is sort of on the decline right now, right? Like, I mean, who really trusts? Like, we don't trust our political institutions anymore. We don't, we may or may not trust doctors and physicians. There's a lot of folks who are, sorry, no offense. I'm always like realizing, wait, is there a doctor in the room? But it's also just because, obviously, well, yeah. There's a whole, we've given all of our data to Facebook and look at what they've done with it, There's just trust is on the decline, but I would say, getting away from the macro picture for a second, just thinking about our individual interactions and our credibility with people, like without trust, basically, I think our ability to be an effective witness, an effective leader / evangelist is pretty low. Can someone please read this? Titus 2:1-8. This is a letter from Paul to Timothy, I believe. Is that right?
To Titus.
Sorry, to Titus.
I'm like, wait.
This is a letter that Paul writes to Titus about leadership. So,
I'll read it.
yes.
You go. Okay. You, however, must teach what is appropriate to sound doctrine. Teach the older men to be temperate, worthy of respect, self-controlled, and sound in faith, in love, and in endurance. Likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. Then they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of God. Similarly, encourage the young men to be self-controlled. In everything, set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, show integrity, seriousness, and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about us.
You can see we did not bold the line and to be subject to their husbands.
Context. Yes.
Exactly. Context. Let's just be clear, the Vineyard's an egalitarian movement, and that's all I have to say about that. Especially in this room, I mean, my gosh.
The ancient text does not translate to but the principles do.
We deliberately took out, does anyone know the phrase that comes after this?
No.
It's the one about slaves that has been completely abused and taken out of
It's just an
context.
employee.
Maybe.
Fair enough. I want to. What we do want to draw your attention to are these are the areas that have been bolded. You know, in terms like temperate, self-control. You know, we're gonna. I'll come back to this, but I basically just want to. I want to do two things, and then I want to basically leave time for both for us to discuss as a group. I want to talk about the attributes of trustworthy leaders, and then just some of the practices of trustworthy. Actually, are there any questions so far? Okay, so let's talk about some of the attributes of trustworthy leaders, and then I'll talk about the practices. So first, I call it skillful living. It's basically the Proverbs life. Wise, temperate, industrious. If you go back here to the prior one, you know, you see words like temperate, self-controlled, you know, worthy of respect, self-controlled and pure. Basically, I think trustworthy people, their lives are working. And I don't mean that they're successful. That's actually not the definition of a life that's working. Winning is not necessarily skillful living. It might be, but that's not. They're not one to one. When I talk about skillful living, I'm talking about you know, the kind. There are people out there whose lives they have this sort of. I think David Brooks called it the eulogy attributes, right? They're resume attributes. Like, so most people in New York, when they think of someone who's skillful living, they think about the resume attributes. Like, what are you good at? And how are you monetizing what you're good at? How are you accruing power based on what you're good at? But the eulogy attributes are the attributes that people would talk about at your funeral. But it's the kinds of things that, it's like how people deal with difficult situations in life, how they navigate some of the vagaries of life. I think perhaps like the best compliment I've gotten in like a very, very long time was, you know, everyone knows that, you know, Janice, my younger sister, passed away last summer. And I think it was maybe, you know, within days or maybe like, you know, a week or so after she passed, we had one of our Thursday gatherings, and it was someone's birthday. I don't remember exactly whose it was, but I came up just to say hello. And this fellow just noticed, he's like, you know, I was just, he I don't remember exactly how he put it, but his phrasing was that, you know, in the middle of such grief of, you know, whatever you're going through, you were able to just sort of come and extend yourself to the community, to the person whose birthday that it was. And, you know, you know, that was obviously not, life wasn't working from a functional, you know, it's certainly not winning when you lose a family member like that. But the point I think he was trying to make was the manner in which it was being handled, the manner in which you were navigating such a difficult situation, kind of, it made an impression on him, much more so than, you know, whatever winning impression, whatever impression winning might make. And so skillful living is one of the attributes that I think are present in trustworthy leaders. Number two, integrity. Like, this is sort of an obvious one. People talk about integrity all the time. Integrity just means, obviously, the idea that the things that we say and our actions are sort of lined up. I really love this verse, 1 Timothy 3:9. Keep hold of the deep truths or the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. So it's like there are these deep mysteries about life with God, you know, but you hold it with a clear conscience. It's like generosity, right? Like the way, it's a total mystery how generosity works in the Bible. But people who are generous, they're actually able to, they live out that mystery. And they do so with a clear conscience because they're actually able to live out like these crazy teachings that Jesus has about the Bible and money. So trustworthy people tend to be people of high integrity. The third attribute, obviously this list isn't exhaustive, but intimacy. It's sort of the ease with which someone people, it's the ease with which someone can approach you and confide in you, right? It's this idea that people who are high on intimacy, they just have this like mental and emotional space for others. And what's interesting is, I think it's like one of the New Yorkiest things about New York is like, you go into any room, and like, one thing that just like makes me wanna explode is like, sometimes it feels like everybody in a room, especially in a networking environment, is constantly trying to figure out how to leverage a situation for themselves. Like that's basically, and I get it because everyone's trying to get ahead. This is honestly like, it kind of breaks my heart. Like there are these like events, I don't even want to go into it. There are just these horrible settings sometimes, and I'm just like, gosh, this is no different. A bunch of believers in a room, and all they're doing is trying to figure out, okay, who do I need to talk to sort of advance my cause, and like, so their whole MO is basically, how do I extend, sort of project self. And so I think people who are trustworthy, they have this ability, they don't give that energy, because part of it is, I think they just, have an a priori grounding, but there's just like this feeling that there's like room. There's room in their life, there's room in their mental space, there's room in their emotional space for others. And that makes them easy to like actually confide in. It makes people want to share like hard things with them. It makes people want to even like confess things, for example. So these are 3 attributes: skillful living, being a person of integrity, and then this idea of being a person who's high on intimacy.
John,
Yes.
tell me your thoughts on temperate.
Temperate, yeah. To me, that's kind of like being self-controlled. Oh, I'm not great at this, so. I've got that sort of hot blood in me that, so I can be, but yeah, temperate to me is like just sort of, it's a combination of like self-control and understanding like, how to not, God, Father Rollheiser has a great take on this. It's like, there's something about temperate people, they're able to absorb like anxious energy and not just throw it back out. You know what I mean? Like, so that's sort of my problem is like, if I don't like something, like, if something comes at me that's like, that I don't agree with or I don't like, I'm prone to just like throw it back out. It's like, so with my son today, like I was telling Mike, I had it out with my son because he was being disrespectful, and that drives me nuts. And so he threw it out at me, and I just threw it back hard, like 10 times harder, basically, to just power up and be like, whatever 5 units you give, I'm gonna counter that with 50. And physically, rhetorically, at every level. That was like basically the opposite of temperance, whereas to be temperate would have been to somehow absorb his disrespect and to not give back out that, but to give something else that would diffuse, that would kind of reframe the environment, so to speak. Like that's how I think about people who are temperate. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
I have a thought.
Go ahead.
I think one of the things that I've learned in struggling with this, because I struggle with self-control, I just want to add to it. I read something recently, I shared it with a couple people that are in the room. I shared it with you too, Kara, I think. And remember, it was from like Desiring God thing.
Yeah.
But the whole thing that they were saying, which I found really encouraging for me, because like some of the things that I can't control in my life, like I literally I lose. Like I've never been able to win. But in this article, it was saying that one of the things that the Holy Spirit does that a lot of times the church doesn't talk about, one of like the greatest gifts that the Holy Spirit gives, is the gift of self-control. And it's kind of like, so I just offer that like just to the conversation, because it's something I'm discovering recently, that when I get to the end of the exertion of my will, because I don't have a very powerful will, in that space between the end of the exertion of my strength and where God's calling me to live the impossible life of Jesus, He doesn't leave me helpless there. He comes and infuses me with power that's supernatural to make manifest in me things that I can't control.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add that because otherwise it becomes, I was in 12-step fellowship for a long time, and a lot of they call it white knuckling.
Yeah.
A lot of times, not just sobriety, but earning money or whatever it is that you're trying to do, the white knuckling is to grit and bear it, and that's the exertion of the will. And yeah, so I've just been finding a lot of space that, like, when I come up, like, wow, I really suck at executing this well, the Holy Spirit's like, well, I can help you, you want it? But I
Right.
have to ask.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Totally.
I didn't mean I wasn't trying to, like, teach, I'm just
No,
offering what
this, you don't need to apologize, bro. We're all just here.
It's not like you.
Alright, was that temperate?
That was an example of taking something and throwing out sarcasm. Oh man. Okay,
So I have a
attributed
quick-
wittiness.
Can I ask a quick
Yes.
question for you, actually? This white knuckling in the 12-step, do
Yeah.
they view that as a negative or as a positive?
I view it as a negative because, like, I read this in Mike T's book, which actually started this whole trouble for me, is that,
Main and plain?
no, he wrote this,
A different one?
His
Yeah.
life story?
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
and he called it the 13th step, and I got really pissed off at him at first. I'm like, dude, you're gonna kill people with this. But then as I read it, I really started to realize it's true, because our will is so limited in the simple fact we're all gonna die. Like, if our will was strong enough, we'd stop that one grand thing from happening. So no matter how good our will is, we all suffer that. And the white knuckling is the place we don't allow the Holy Spirit to have more take over. You know, I don't say come Holy Spirit because I don't think he's out there. I know he's in here. Rather, I say take more,
Yeah.
because there's all sorts of ground in me that isn't surrendered.
Yeah.
That's so the white knuckling's bad because even though it might keep you alive, you're not living freely. You're living another form of enslavement. And particularly with the demographic that we find ourselves surrounded by, they're not going to be attracted to that. They're not going to see that as fruit in me. Like Amy Winehouse, remember that Papa told me to go to rehab, I said no, now she's dead. She wouldn't have been attracted to the white knuckling because she'd go, either I get intoxicated and at least feel good, or I gotta do that, screw it, I'm just gonna stay like this.
Totally.
There has to be a better fruit scene,
Totally.
Yeah.
but it has to be the Holy Spirit that births it, because I can't do it. I don't,
This is totally, I mean, like, these are, I'm glad Debbie asked just about being temperate. Like, when I'm not temperate, I power up. And that, like, shuts everyone else around me down because, like, in some sense, I do have, like, power. And so it literally is very unattractive. I heard it from Kara ceaselessly. Like, no, and it is. Look, it is because what it's like. Guess what? That's how the world is. And who there's nothing redemptive in that. All that is just playing. It's like that's playing the Game of Thrones. That's playing the House of Cards game that everyone else plays. So great. Okay, so let's just talk about a couple practices of trustworthy leaders. The first is consistency. This is, most folks here have been around for a while. In New York for a while, it seems like, but in general, consistency is one of the, there's obviously geographical consistency, but there's just consistency that we're talking about at a higher level here, which is just the idea of people know where you stand on things. There's so much blowing in the wind these days, and people are not just here today, gone tomorrow, but their perspectives are so easily shifted, basically based on their feelings or their emotions, and I think that doesn't breed a lot of trust. It actually, that's actually one of the great trust breakers, is people can't really tell where you're going to land on something. Number two, talks least and then says most. In my yearbook, going way back now, my high school yearbook, we had two categories. We had somebody who talks most and says the least, which is like a really bad thing, obviously. So those are the chatterboxes, right? But then there are some folks who they said they talk the least, but they say the most. So in a sense, it's like their words matter. You know, it's sort of like the opposite of gossip. There's that song. I'm not gonna sing it, although I want to. I was so drawn to it. It's an old like worship song. So I'll let my words be few. Jesus, I am so in love with you.
How does it go?
That's Matt Redman.
So I'll let my words be few.
Oh, hey. Up the octave, John.
But I think I'm drawn to that because I think that there's just a lot of talking without like saying much. There's something about being efficient with our words that is actually a big part of what trustworthy leaders do. The signal to noise ratio, in other words, is very high. So in Titus 2:3, it says, don't be slanderers or gossipers. 2:7, show seriousness and soundness of speech. Like, that's really good. I mean, that's sort of why, when we do Lectio here, I know the leaders of Lectio are like talking about how to make sure that people limit their commentary. Because, if somebody starts talking for like 6 minutes during Lectio, Janine, I think, is going to start going like this, or she's going to do something to like basically try to diffuse, because there's something about learning how to speak efficiently that actually engenders trust. So I love when someone's leading and somebody says, well, I noticed the following. And then you just leave it at that. You don't have to like preamble it. They don't have to like give the, so on and so forth in the backstory to it. So, practice number 3, readily giving power away. Tim Keller often talks about like, there are 2 great tests for a Christian, suffering and winning. And so like when you win, what happens? What do you do when you win? So people who, when you win and actually have some power, like what do you do with that? And this is sort of the, these last 2 are things that are really pretty serious problems, I think, in a lot of local churches. So I'll talk about, just to flesh out number 3, is that it never ceases to amaze me how senior leaders are just so afraid to give away their power. It's like, this could be true of any church, but like I remember I once at our old church, I was like, hey, we should just allow some other folks to preach. Because who the heck wants to listen to the same person 45 times a year? I don't care how good you are, even if you're Tim Keller, even if you're, who else is a really
Mike
good preacher?
Mazzata.
Well, look at you giving all that up. No one can bring the goods 50 times a year, and like the anxiety around just allowing. The pulpit is obviously, look, that's a place of power. You have somebody's attention for 30 to 40 minutes every Sunday. There are very few places that's a place of power. I'm not saying you give it away cheaply, but a willingness to give it away, or just in general. This is part of what I think just drew us so much to the Vineyard, and it's still that's something that confounds a lot of folks that I'm around even today, is that like the Vineyard always was just like, hey, whatever God is doing in us is what made John Wimber such a unique person. He's like, just take it, we don't need to put our name on it, we don't need to like, brand it Vineyard, to their detriment in some sense. And that's just totally the attitude that we want to, that's what embeds trust. Like the amount of like infighting that goes on in the faith community in New York, because everyone's trying to basically protect their turf. And they're all worried like, oh my gosh, this person's gonna like, take what I've done and like co-opt it. And a lot of those fears are real, because like a number of people I've seen like just sort of try to come in and like co-opt what someone else is doing. And it's sort of like, it's just, Yeah, I mean, so the bottom line is like trustworthy people, like when they accrue some influence, when they accrue some power, they're just like, you know what, this isn't mine. They don't give it away cheaply, but they give it away wherever it belongs. And like one of my favorite examples of this is like the way the Vineyard essentially influenced the Alpha Course. I mean, the Alpha Course, most people associate with, Alpha and HTV. But it was the ministry of the Holy Spirit that, the Vineyard basically just, through folks like John and Eleanor, that essentially infused the Alpha Course to the point where now the pinnacle of the Alpha Course is essentially Holy Spirit Day. Okay, the last one is actually a really important one. I don't know why, I saved it for last, I guess. Resilience when exposed. Resilience when exposed. So here's what I mean by this. If you're in leadership, whether inside the church or wherever it is, you're going to be exposed. What I mean by that is people are going to talk about you. Then they're going to say some not so nice things about you. What are you going to do with that? What are you going to do? What are you going to do when that happens? Like, this is like, nothing creates more anxiety for most pastors that I know than them being talked about by people in their church, people outside, whoever it is. Like, it just, and look, of course it's anxiety inducing. I mean, who wants to know that there's somebody or a group of people in a room somewhere saying something about you? That's like a horrible feeling. But guess what? It's gonna happen. And trying to like stop it, like that's the thing that has always like driven me nuts, is like there are a lot of like senior pastors that just get so anxious at the idea, they almost try to like tell people don't do that. And what they tell people is instead, don't you three people talk about me, all of you people come to me directly. But all that does, it allows them to then control the narrative in a one-on-one way, because they're afraid of the exposure that comes when people talk about that. But guess what? In the church, outside the church, it doesn't matter. You're gonna get exposed. Sometimes that stuff is gonna be a little bit, it'll be out of line, or it'll be out of bounds. And this is where obviously a strong measure of discernment matters. But a lot of times, it's gonna be real, and it's gonna be true. And so then the question from there is like, what are you gonna do? How are you gonna handle it when you're exposed? This is an incredibly relevant issue right now, because somebody who was a huge influence on tons of people, myself included, this guy named Bill Hybels, basically was exposed about a year ago. And what has he done? To the best that I can tell, he's just hiding. He's just hiding. I personally think like the world, a large portion of the world, I think, just wants him to admit it. Just admit what happened. Admit what you did. It'll be terrible, but basically, I really, in my heart of hearts, believe that I think people want to forgive him. Well, maybe not everyone. Look, yeah, but that's their issue. But like, when you're exposed, when bad stuff is said about you, and some of it's going to be true, the question is really, are you able to be resilient? Are you able to like actually receive that and demonstrate that, that you're going to live out a redemptive path along those lines? Yeah, this is a massively challenging thing. I hope that Karen and I, we're under no disillusion. We're a year and a half into the 166 experiment, and I always tell her, like every third week before we go to sleep, I'm like, I'm shocked at how little drama we have in our community. We have very little drama. Or maybe I don't know about it. But I don't think we have much. But one day we will. Surely we will. And you know, in some sense, like, I actually, I want to pre-commit to having the channels where stuff, you know, our warts, my warts, because you don't have any, my warts are going to be exposed. They're going to find, and sooner, if they haven't already, they're going to drive somebody crazy. And if there isn't a release valve for that, beyond just telling buds, you know, the typical pattern is, hey, maybe this place isn't for you. If there's not a release valve for people to like discuss, bring to my attention the things that I do that drive me crazy, all my blind spots, and a space for me to work it out as well. Space for me to work it out as well. And kind of like, what are we doing here, in a sense, you know? So, in summary, consistency, don't talk a lot, but say a lot. You know, be ready to give the power away that you do accrue wisely, and then be resilient in the face of exposure.
Are there questions, maybe?
Okay, yeah, actually, are there any questions on these 4 practices of trustworthy leaders?
Do you have an example of a leader who you think really dealt when exposed in a resilient way?
Yes, we do actually. At Vineyard Columbus, this is all public. There was a scandal, an awful scandal. This was like 5 or 6 years ago. Do you remember this, Jared? A counselor was having an affair.
He was a pastor.
Yeah, sorry. He was a pastor on staff, but he was
On staff.
acting as a counsel to a woman. And the woman's husband walks in and says, you know, I can't believe you're having, you know, tells a guy. And then he immediately approached Rich Nathan, who's a senior pastor at the church. And Rich walked into the guy's office and he's like, is this true? And the guy said, yes, it's true. And so he fired him on the spot. The press was all over this. I mean, mega church, sex scandal, like, it's like, you know, it was a feeding frenzy for the media. And basically they were, their attitude was, you know what, we are not gonna hide. We're gonna actually tell everybody exactly what happened, and we're gonna walk through this in a super transparent way. Keep people updated on exactly what the redemptive path is. I can't remember the fellow's name. Steve Robinson, yeah. And about several years after, I mean, he had gone through a whole process. Obviously, there was sort of a, you know, there were certain things that he wasn't permitted to do, but I think it was maybe 3 or 4 years after the affair was revealed, he was basically reinstated. I mean, it was like this, and I remember the service where basically Rich invited him up to take communion together. And look, I'm sure there was a lot there that we never saw that was like horrible and dirty, but I think to me it was like, oh, like there's actually a way, there is like, if you actually trust the gospel, you know, it's amazing how it's actually hard to trust the gospel when you're exposed. And like, but if you actually, you know, if you believe in sort of like the long-term justice of God in some sense, and are willing to submit to it, I don't know if it always works out, but in that example it did. That was like really beautiful to see when he invited him up to have communion as he was reinstated into pastoral ministry.
Johnny Carroll Wimber's right-hand man and left-hand man at different times both fell. One went into hiding and changed his whole lifestyle and ran away from God. And one that I was very close to came back and faced it. He should not have been restored to his former role, but he was restored to it was very painful. It was a nightmare, but he faced it. And then when it got harder and harder, he kept facing it and facing it, and he was restored to community.
Yeah, that's
It's a
basically, I
beautiful
think
story.
that's a very similar story. They were not restored to their former role, obviously, for whatever reason. Not to say that it was impossible to ever be fully restored, but, you know, it was sufficient to,
But also these things were true. This was
Yeah.
not, and gossip is a whole different, gossip that's not true is a whole different story, but these things actually happened. The people did them.
correct. I mean, there are certain moral failings that are black and white-ish. Affairs and money are two of them. Most of the time, when when you're exposed, it's gonna not be a black and whitish thing. It's gonna be like a, you know, I don't know. I mean, it'll sound like, you know, hey, you're actually, you know, incredibly power hungry.
Yeah, the appetite that brought it on is what has to be addressed very thoroughly.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, you know, I don't know if you guys know the name Mark Driscoll, but he basically had a pretty significant failing that was more along the lines of he was abusive to his colleagues. He was, and you know, I don't know exactly. I don't actually know all the details of his case. So my point is more that when people have issues with you, it's not going to be necessarily something that can be. It's not a binary yes/no thing. It's oftentimes just something about the way you are. You know, when I think I get a lot of complaints and feedback just around, you know, I can be dismissive. I can make people feel a certain way, especially when I'm tired or if I'm feeling the need to power up. And those are all, like, I have a laundry list of reasons why I can defend why I behaved the way I behaved, and that's typically always a first reaction. But you know, these are things that are still true, but the precise nature in which they're true actually requires obviously some self-reflection. So. Any other thoughts or questions?
I think there's also a difference, you know, in the examples that were shared. You know, like some are just you did a one-time act and it was a sinful act, you fell into sin, and that is probably even easier to address than like if somebody is just in their personality abusive,
Correct.
right? That's
Correct.
much more difficult than to correct, and you can't just say, oh, we're doing a whatever 1 to 2 year, you know, whatever program with you, restoration program, and you're being reinstated. It's harder than.
Indeed. Let's do the following. We have 2 questions that I actually thought we should just do together as a large group, and a third question that we may want to break up into smaller groups. Think about leaders that you trust either in your life or in the public life. What do they carry that made you trust them? So hopefully there exists a leader that you do trust, because they are in short supply these days. We are not in a target-rich environment. But just think about somebody you do trust. What is it that they carry that makes you trust them? I'll give maybe like a minute, and then we'll kind of come together. trust?
I do. Trust Randy Clark.
Okay.
That Mary and I went to school with. I mean, he is in no way perfect, but I think he's pretty aware of his imperfections. And I think the thing that he carries that makes me trust him is just a sense of humbleness.
Mm-hmm.
Like he told us one time that he said, I feel like I've preached and done this stuff for long enough that I could walk into a meeting and I could kind of like I could fake it.
Right.
I could make people feel like the Holy Spirit. just from like
Just totally.
exactly the way
yeah.
that he does it. He said, he said, but I don't want to sacrifice all the things that I've sacrificed in my life, time away from my family and stuff like that, if that's what it's going to be. So yeah, this sense of humbleness about who he is and who God is. Yeah.
I hear self-awareness in your commentary as well.
Yeah.
Just obviously we talked about that as a group here, and I think that's something that's going to keep on coming up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know Randy well. I've only interacted with him at a very, very arm's length, but I can totally see what you're talking about. Good.
I trust my Bickle. I've
Yeah.
had the privilege of, working closely with some of the leaders that I have, and
Mhm.
the way he is on the platform, because I've sat in so many meetings, like management meetings with him, and I've never heard him say one bad thing about any ministry, any person, even though he's gotten so much like flack.
Thrown at him.
And I hear this from his assistant.
Yeah.
Like, and even I hear it, and I'm just like, he's never said anything, and that's what he preaches from the platform. Behind the scenes, he's never, like, in any meeting, I just really respect him, because he's never said anything negative about anyone, even though he gets so much, and it's like, this is
Not
really a
gossiping.
father. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Totally. Totally.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, and I was thinking about leader as well, or even two. With Corey, humility was just like the thing that came to me, and I felt like it's like it's almost like a sun. There's some kind of gravitational force, like everything that surrounds them is sort of around humility, and it kind of makes it so I can trust them, because I feel like I don't know why that is. If when they're wearing it, and if they're in a place of power or whatever, or they're in a place of influence, even if it's just a church, when they're wearing that, if they have a large church or a small church, but either way, when they have that, I end up trusting them a lot.
Totally. Totally.